Jonathan Holmes joins us now from our Sydney studio. He's the host of the ABC's Media Watch program, the perfect man to talk to ahead of his program on Monday night, where no doubt he'll be desperately hoping for an extra 15 minutes to talk about these media laws and some of the reaction to them. Jonathan, thank you so much for appearing here on Sky News.
That's fine, Paul. Hi.
Yeah, now, I know that it's a ridiculous thing to ask such a broad question up front, but why not? What was your general sense of where these laws are coming from? Is it about protecting the reader, the viewer, or is it about trying to have a whack at the owner's most likely news corporation?
I have to say I think it's both, Paul. I think that the media in general doesn't tell you what everybody out there actually knows, which is there is a deep mistrust of the mainstream media and it's growing. That's what the Finkelstein report said. That's what our mailbag says every week. There is a great feeling out there that there should be a way of controlling the media or at least having it answerable and be able to complain and get some results the same way that you can about David Jones or about your telephone service or anything else. But also, I think there's no doubt that this government feels very hard done by News Limited and would love to be able to do something about that. And certainly, I think that they don't want News Limited to have any more power than it already has.
The worst interpretation of the laws, and ones that are its chief critics believe that it's a crackdown on freedom of speech because by putting a government oversight body on the top of the Press Council, ultimately the government gets to be in charge of what stories make it or not. That's the worst possible reading of it from people who talk about these things on the internet. Of course, the reality is somewhat in from that position. But what is your worst case scenario reading of the laws as you've been able to understand them?
There's two parts of it, and I'm much more comfortable talking about that part that's about complaints mechanisms, the Press Council, all that stuff, than I am about the mergers. Simply because, you know, when it gets into the realm of high finance, I can understand why people feel, and, you know, Kim Williams and many, many others, that this public interest test is going to be very vague. It's going to be extremely hard for people who want to do deals to know whether they're going to get past that test or not, and to have just one person making a fairly arbitrary decision. I can see that is a real worry for them. But on the press regulation side, I don't think it's nearly nothing like the kind of crisis of freedom of speech that your Andrew Bolts or your Kim Williamses are telling us. What is going to happen may actually have virtually no effect whatsoever, except, I think, in the immediate future, the people that need to worry are Seven West Media in the West, because they have left the Press Council, which I'm sure will get the stamp of approval from this new public interest media advocate. If you look at the laws and the things that it has to do, the Press Council in its new form, with its new rules and its new money, does all of those things. But Seven West Media's rebel independent media council that it's set up in the West, even though it's got very distinguished people on it, doesn't pass all of those tests. For example, if you want to complain about the West newspaper, you have to complain to the West first. You can't go to the complaints tribunal immediately. And that's one of the tests that this advocate is going to have to look at. So I think there's going to be the first test for that advocate, if it ever happens, if it gets through the Parliament and all of that, will be what are they going to do about Seven West? Because if they say no, you're not good enough, then Kerry Stokes is either going to change his rules so that it complies, or he's going to go crawling back to the Press Council, neither of which I think are all that likely, or he's going to say, get stuffed.
Now, can you give us an idea, you and so many of the people that have sat in your seat over the years, it seems to be that a constant frustration is that if you get a successful complaint up under the current system, that the apology ends up being about an 18th the size of the original misdemeanour, and it's about 48 pages deeper into the newspaper. In the Jonathan Holmes world, if you got to write the laws, where would the apology be?
Look, we're already in the Julian Disney world. Since Disney took over the Press Council, he has pushed through, with, I have to say, a lot of help from News Limited, remarkably perhaps. But they have been, of the big boys, the most cooperative with Julian Disney, and they are completely in accord with these new rules. And And one of them is that you've got to publish apologies with a fair degree of prominence. Now, if you look at the Daily Telegraph, for example, if the Press Council finds against it, it's been publishing the Press Council findings on page 2, even page 3, with a relatively large headline, much more prominent than it did a few years ago. So that's already a huge improvement.
So if they're already doing that, does it need to be codified with legislation?
Well, you may well ask. I mean, I think one of the ironies of this situation is that all the fuss started before the Press Council got these new rules, and there's no doubt that it was the pressure of the Finkelstein inquiry, among other things, one suspects, that made it realise that, and this has always been the case with press regulation, that the self-regulation strengthens when the pressure of regulatory, statutory regulation grows. But whatever the reason, the funding was doubled. There's rules now that you can't leave for 3 or 4 years, once you've signed on, and you have to publish apologies much more prominently and to the satisfaction of the Press Council, all of those kinds of things. So, you might still think the Press Council is, a slap on the wrist and all the rest of it. But I have to say, I think it's a bit faster and a bit more effective than ACMA, than the ACMA, which is the statutory regulator for the broadcasters, and as everybody knows, is extraordinarily slow and very often dishes out the limpest of wrist slaps.
Of the legislation that you've been able to have a look at, and again, the things that have been there through Finkelstein and other things, there are increasingly a lot more forums that are on stations like this, programs like this, that are opinion shows. Now, I sound stupid saying this, but I will anyway, directly to you, so I'll offer you up the grab that you can run on Monday night, is that being opinionated and having an opinion means that not always are you going to present the both sides of the story in the fashion that you would, in the impartial fashion that is a news report. How do you think that opinion should be governed and regulated?
I don't think it should be governed or regulated at all, except by the law of the land. We very seldom take on opinion on Media Watch, for example. And for that matter, I very seldom try to tackle what's perceived as political bias, even in news stories, because it's so dicey. I mean, one person's bias is another person's, telling it like it is.
Absolutely.
I mean, ironically, one of the very few times that and I'll tell this story against myself, one of the very few times that we criticised a newspaper for biased news, we had a go at the Daily Telegraph and Andrew Clennell, and I ended up having a finding against me for being unfair by ACMA, and I had to apologise to Clennell. So, bias, and especially in opinion, is just a really difficult thing for anybody to regulate. And I don't think that is what is going to occur at all. I mean, I think these people who are saying, that this new advocate is going to dictate what you can write and what you can't write, and going to take individual newspapers and say that they can't have the exemption from the Privacy Act. This is simply, to use the word of Kim Williams, bollocks. That isn't the way it's going to work. I don't think, and I don't think there's anything in the legislation that says so.
All right, last one here, and no doubt it's a preview of what you're going to do on Monday night, but what did you think of that front page? That front page, and I can almost refer to it that way, that was the front page of the Daily Telegraph, where they compared Stephen Conroy to some of the great despots in history, and then their apology for it today was by apologising to Joseph Stalin for comparing him to Stephen Conroy. What do you think of it?
I'm sorry, Paul, I'm going to reserve what I think about that till Monday night.